Okay, well, thanks very much for coming to see the video. I'm very excited to introduce my next guest. So French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, English, Japanese, Arabic, Cantonese. I hope I've got those all correct. These are the languages that my guest speaks to varying levels. So it's an incredible amount of work that he's put in to learn these different languages. Internationally renowned polyglot, successful podcaster. I believe you're on episode 400, 400 and
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And also best-selling author. I have the French book here. I don't have the Spanish one. It's a great series. It's something that's definitely helped me with sort of getting used to the French vocabulary, the questions after, playing to practice. I picked mine up in Waterstones, but I believe it's in a number of shops. You can get it on Amazon or on your website, I will teach you a language.com. So without further ado, Olly Richards, how are you?
I'm good. And it's great to be here. Thanks for that wonderful intro.
Mm-hmm. I was running over it in my head. I hope I got it right then. And I was like, I hope I don't get these languages wrong. I had to write them down.
It's always a funny one with languages because there's a deeper discussion to be had behind every single one of those. Mm-hmm. But in the internet world, it kind of clarity usually pays off. Mm-hmm. So I usually say, 8 languages, and we'll leave it there.
Well, you know yourself, because like once you dive into it, there's varying levels. There's even in English, I'm still learning. Yeah. So we're picking up new words every day. But so I'm very happy to have you on because I wanted to talk about your projects and stuff. I believe you started off with these were your first books, weren't they? The short stories.
They were, yeah. So I actually began writing these books back in it must have been 2015, I think it was, or 2014, 2015. And the first book I wrote was a book of short stories in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that I'm a big believer in reading and stories in particular as a way to learn. But I have always felt that it's very difficult to find interesting graded readers. Mm-hmm. in any market. I used to teach English, and there's tons of graded readers in English, but they're so dull. It's like old kind of Jane Austen and Sherlock Holmes and stuff, which is fine. But I personally prefer to read more kind of modern, fresh, fun stuff. Mm-hmm. And that really doesn't exist in other languages. So I set about writing my first book in Spanish in order to make something interesting like this. And then it did really well. So I made it in other languages too. And then eventually I ended up partnering with Teach Yourself to expand it, to make the books look prettier, and then expand into, over 20 languages now at this point.
I think you definitely hit the nail on the head, because you know yourself, like whenever you have a high level of a language, you're exposed to so much of the culture, you can dip into it in so many different avenues. But at the very beginning, you're limited to like Peppa Pig, in different languages, and like these things that aren't really that appealing.
Or useful, because how useful is it? Do you really need to know how to say muddy puddle in Spanish or in other languages, right? I mean,
that's a thing. And did you have any resources like that available to you when you started dipping into the languages? What did you do?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been graded readers in kids' books and things like that. But that's a concept. The concept of a graded reader is something we've all heard of. It's just that when it comes to learning through immersion or through input, we might talk about this later. One of the important elements is that it's comprehensible, so it has to be at the right level for you. But the other very important element is it has to be compelling, which means it needs to be something that you really, really, really want to read and that you're genuinely interested in. And so that's always been the problem. It's not necessarily been access to resources, but it's been those quality resources. And so really one of the main things that I try to do with my books is to excite people into wanting to pick up a book and read. And so one of the great things that's happened as a result of these books, I get, like, on a daily basis, I get Instagram messages or emails to my website, which is iwillteachyoualanguage.com, and people saying, like, I've just read my first book in French or Spanish, and I can't believe how much I was able to understand. And it's it can be the beginning of a completely new direction for people into learning. But
I don't know if you're aware of it yourself. Maybe you've heard it also, but like when I've recommended the Spanish version of the books to my students, not only have they said like, oh, it's the first Spanish book I've read, but sometimes they're saying like it's the first book I've read in like 10
Yeah,
years.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
because
yeah.
people don't read that much, you know, as a
Mm.
whole. It depends on the person. So it was actually not only way, it was something for me, like not only an introduction into French, but it gives you like an introduction to French literature, and you start going, well, what else could I read in French? You know, it builds your confidence that way. And also was on looking, and I've seen now, speaking of having like modern resources, you also have a course that's using like slang, social media language. Is that the right way to say it? Like the conversation course.
Yeah, that's right. So we have a number of different books. Another one of the series that I have is it's called 101 Conversations.
Mhm. Yes.
That's the series. And the idea there is it's like a story, but it's told in dialogue format. So you know when you're reading a regular story, it's narrative,
Mhm.
and so you're reading the prose, people describing, telling the story. But with these books, it's actually like a play or theatre. So you're reading the dialogue between people. The idea being that it's helpful for you to improve your speaking because it's all natural dialogue. And then one of those books was called 101 Conversations in Social Media Spanish, and it tells the story of a group of friends who were trapped inside an escape room.
All
You
right.
know what those things are, where you have to
Yes,
kind of
yes.
work together
Love to do myself.
to find their way out. And they get separated and trapped, and so they have to communicate on social media like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger,
Ah,
Instagram,
okay,
in
yes.
order to figure their way out. And
Uh-huh.
so the idea there was, I just wanted to, I just like experimenting, with different concepts
Definitely out of the
of
box. Yeah.
things.
Yeah, but it's definitely a good way because, as you say, because if you have a narrative, it's very refined. The pauses are different. The intonation's different. Do you know? And you know yourself, like through like teaching English or through teaching other languages or learning, like you'll get this very refined version of a language. It's the same way like when I've taught English in academies and the students are used to listening to. And now we're going to page 3, and then I walk in and I'm like, okay, today we're gonna,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
realize there's a variety of dialects, there's a variety of accents, and in the real world, like conversation evolves differently. Another course I was really excited about, which I thought was really good, and I think I don't know if you mentioned this before that you had an interest in history, but you have a series on World War II through Spanish.
Yeah, that's right. So again, like because I'm just always experimenting with stuff. So one of the other series that we've created is it's called the Topics That Matter series, and so
Yeah.
it's basically like reading graded readers, except it's non-fiction rather than fiction. So one of these books is World War II in simple Spanish. So it's basically telling the story of World War II, which is of course like infinitely interesting
Yeah.
and important, right? And something that a lot of people might read about in their own native language. So why not read about it in Spanish? And it's kind of simplified slightly so that it's more accessible.
Mhm.
And then we have another book which is Climate Change in simple Spanish. To read about climate science in Spanish. And we're expanding this series into lots of other topics which are a secret for the time being. But people really love this stuff because not everybody likes fiction, right? Lots of people like reading non-fiction too.
I'm not a big fan of fiction. Compared to most of my ones are things like
Yeah.
non-fiction, like psychology or science and things like that myself, you know. But it's a really interesting series. But for a number, I'm actually really excited, and I think I will check it out because it kind of feels like one, obviously you're picking up different like phrases in the language, you're learning, you're improving your confidence, but also you're killing two birds with one stone. Because a lot of people want to have a more in-depth knowledge of these things, like World War II. They might have an idea from school, but you're kind of like getting a summarized version and studying at the same time, which is always a really interesting thing to do.
Well, the ultimate goal that we want, right? The thing that we're trying to get to is that everyone, when you're learning a language, you're reading native content
Mhm.
for pleasure. That's the ultimate goal. Because for someone learning Spanish, if you can swap out your reading habits, so rather than reading the latest um, the latest Harry Potter book in English,
Mhm.
instead you go and read that same book in Spanish. Or if you want to learn about gardening, rather than reading that book in English, you just pick up the Spanish version of the gardening book
Yeah.
and you start consuming all of your content in the target language. You've won the game at that point, right? Because then it's just a
Yeah.
matter of time until you reach a native level in the language, because that is how languages are acquired, through reading and through immersion in your in your target language.
I'm sure it's something you've done yourself, or somebody sends you like a link in Spanish or like an audio or a movie, whatever, and or sorry, in English, and you instantly see if there's a version in a different language. You're like, oh, it's interesting. I'll see if there's a version in Spanish, or or like putting on like the dubbing in a different language, and so just to have that wee extra bit of like access to the language in a way. But without going off on a tangent, it's a very interesting thing as well, because I suppose you've noticed the difference between when an English speaker learns a foreign language. We use a lot of L1, like you have a lot of English in it, and it's more difficult to get immersion. Where if you go to other countries around the world and they're learning English, a lot of it tends to be totally in English. So like we like in schools and stuff, a lot of ours is just a translation method, isn't it? As opposed
Yeah.
to more of like a communicative approach. So it is definitely a way to start consuming, like that native.
I mean, the thing about if we just use the term immersion as a kind of broad brushstroke here to talk about learning in this way, like, I think everybody intuitively, if you stop the average man in the street and say, what is the ultimate language learning method? Everyone is going to say, well, it's immersion, right? I just go and, in an ideal world, I just go and live in the country, live with the family, be immersed 24/7. Like that. I mean, we all know this to be intuitive, like the best way to learn something, right? Complete and total immersion for years, right? Now, in reality, that's just not possible.
No.
Which means that we're always dealing in terms of second best, right? Okay, well, I can't go and live in Japan with a Japanese family and go to Japanese school and get a Japanese job. Can't do it. So what's next? What's second best? And usually what happens is that people go, okay, well, I can't do that, so I'll just go to Japanese school and go or buy a Japanese textbook, which for me is just the wrong end of the spectrum. It's like you're kind of you're kind of taking the principal idea, which, okay, we know that immersion is best, and so, well, I can't do that, so I'm just going to go to the opposite end of the extreme, where I'm just going to have tuition about the language, which doesn't make any sense. But ultimately, what we want to be doing is getting to a point where we can get as much practical immersion in the language as possible, and it's got to be done in a fun and meaningful way for us. So that's kind of like that's what I'm trying to do with this stuff. It's trying to it's giving you options. You mentioned before about the article. For years, I had this very frustrating experience, which is exactly what you were talking about there, where you get an article and, oh man, I just want to read that in Spanish. And is it available? So you kind of go hunting around and you're going to go to the Spanish version of the website and try and pull it up. And it's just this kind of endless, frustrating experience of wasting time, going down rabbit holes. And it's just anything but actually sitting and enjoying learning the language. Right. And so much of this language learning game, it's not just about knowing what's the best thing to do. It's about actually being able to follow through and do it and execute it. And for that, we've got to have the right surroundings, the right material, the right circumstances, and all these things.
That's a really nice way to put it. I never thought about it that way, about like jumping to the other end of the spectrum, which is what people do, and what you're saying there is about it has to be interesting. It reminds me of that quote, like if you hang around the barber shop long enough, you'll end up getting your hair cut, because like it's just showing up, it's just hanging around the language long enough, like having it interesting in a way, that it's challenging, and yourself, it's about being consistent as opposed to someone who wants the best method in the world. They'll probably do, instead of doing 3 hours one day, it's better to do 10 minutes a day for a year, or for 5 years. But leading on from that, so I got a lot of responses because I put up in my Instagram stories that I was going to be speaking to yourself. And I got some common questions. You've probably heard these a million times, but I think it just sort of excited the users. They could sort of get a chance to ask you some of the questions. So one of the questions that was sent to me was, do you think that anyone can learn a second language?
Yeah, of course. No question. The key word there is learn. Right? Because it's like, what are we talking about here? Do I think anyone can become native level in another language? No, probably not.
Difficult.
But can anyone learn to have a conversation in another language? Absolutely. So the answer is definitely yes. But then there are degrees, right? And then that's where it gets sticky.
It reminds me of one of the episodes in one of your podcasts. You mentioned about, I can't remember which episode it was, but you basically said about some people get obsessed with vocabulary, and like I think you used the example of gardening. Like if you're learning Spanish or French, you're not going to go out and learn all these specific gardening words because maybe in English you don't use those, do you know?
Yeah.
And some people seek that absolute perfection, do you know? Um, Something you touched on in your last YouTube video, which is amazing, that 11 problems that only polyglots will understand. And it was that everyone speaks to me in English. What have you encountered this much, or what's been your?
My
It's something
entire
like
life, yeah.
I'm in Cambridge B1 Central in Spain. You know, everyone wants the Cambridge exams. It's something I felt. What's been your experience of it?
It's the native English speaker curse. It's, you know, wherever you go in the world, you are a walking practice machine, or not, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. It's like you are. So I think the basic dynamic is often that because the rest of the world learning English tends to speak better English than we speak our target language, right? So if you take your average English speaker learning Spanish, they might be at a kind of, I don't know, A2 level perhaps. But then around the world, your average person learning English is probably at least a B1 level, B2. So this is obviously not always the case, but generally speaking, people around the world have a better level of English than we have in the language that we're learning, at least at the beginning. And so what this means is that in the majority of situations, the person you're talking in the conversation that you're having with whoever it may be, English is always going to be the easier option. So you may want to practice your Spanish or your Japanese or your Arabic or whatever, but if that other person speaks English better than you speak your Spanish or Japanese, then you're kind of swimming against the tide by not just switching to English. And the other person knows that because most English speakers don't speak other languages. And so you're always kind of fighting this temptation, and the obvious fact that it's going to be easier if we just switch to English.
And almost the pressure of us wanting, like, oh, let's go into English, you know, because everyone else is speaking it.
Yeah, and so it depends on the individual, and you're going to meet some people who just insist on English, and they won't let you speak in the language you're learning. I remember living in Japan. Japan's a funny place for lots of reasons, but one of the things about Japan is that Japanese people generally have a hard time accepting that a foreigner can speak Japanese. So you can often, and not always, but it's kind of a well-known meme among foreigners in Japan. Like you can be in Japan and speak to somebody in flawless Japanese, or at least very good Japanese, let's say, and they won't be able to process the fact that you're speaking to them in Japanese, so they'll just reply in broken English. And it's like almost there's like a short circuit there where the expectations that you don't speak Japanese are so high that it actually kind of gets in the way of the reality of the situation. So that's the kind of extreme end of the coin. Other times, you just got people who just want to practice with you, and then often it comes down to a battle of wills. You know, who can stick it out the longest. And for me, being English, we are one of our big characteristics. I was going to say it's a weakness, but who knows? It might be a strength. We're generally very polite people, and we don't like social disruption. And so if you're talking to someone, they're insisting on speaking English with you, our natural tendency is just to keep the peace and go with it. So actually, it's quite tricky to develop the cara dura, as they say in Spanish, right? To be able to be able to say, no, I'm insisting now, we are going to speak Spanish, and I'm going to, I don't care what you say. That's very uncomfortable on a personal level. It's very uncomfortable for me to do that. So
I think Irish are quite stubborn. We just dig our heels in. So they.
Yeah. So the way around that for me is actually to find practice partners, speaking partners who you can practice with on a regular basis, who will allow you to speak in the language, and then you use that to build up your ability in the language until you get to a point where you speak, say, Spanish better than they speak English. And so the logical thing then is to stick in Spanish because it's easier. And so it's like you just got to get over the hump.
Yeah, it's a nice one. Sometimes I find some common ground. I'll be like, oh, look, I'm trying to learn. I have loads of resources if you like help in that, if you need anything in particular. Sometimes I'll offer them Irish, which always seems to kill their one. Like, Although I don't really identify with the things. If you want to learn my native language, I'm happy to teach you Irish, you know. And normally they're like, well, no, it doesn't really benefit me, or anyone, you know.
Yeah.
But
No, I have in the past pretended that I don't speak English.
we have a
I'd
couple.
say like,
We could get away with the same things. I can get away with Polish, Russian, Scandinavian sometimes, you know.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I could probably get away with. See, whenever I go to Brazil, people always call me Allemand, German,
uh,
because this is because like the in South America, it's always funny that their kind of awareness of European countries because of the history of immigration from Europe. But in Brazil, there was a lot of migration from Germany to the south of Brazil. So white blonde people like me, they kind of shorthand for that person is, oh, he must be German. So so I can probably get away with German, sometimes, or maybe Scandinavian, perhaps.
yeah.
But generally speaking, the thing is though that these days, because almost everyone in Europe speaks English anyway, like it's a tall order to claim that you don't speak any English if you look like
Especially
me.
at our age,
So,
maybe if we're about 60 or something, you can be
yeah,
a different generation, you can get away with
maybe,
it, you know.
maybe.
But
But also, to travel internationally now, you have to speak English anyway, just to do anything.
yeah.
So,
You get these wee hidden
like, yeah,
gems in some places who don't. You're like, how have you got here? Do you know, like, how did you,
yeah, yeah,
how did you cross the sea? Do you
yeah.
know, without knowing English? And next one was an interesting question because it hadn't been something I thought about. Why is language learning so addictive? 'Cause it's almost like a cult when you get into it, isn't it? And you have like a wee group and oh, we love this, and you'll share our memes and what 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 do you think it is?
Especially, yeah, it's funny. I often think about language learning as kind of BI and AI, like so before the internet and after the internet, because
Right.
I feel like they were two very different things.
Mhm,
And I started learning languages when I was 19.
mhm,
This was back in the year 2000,
mhm,
and there's no internet then to speak of, and no resources. You had to go down to your local bookshop. So for me, like, early language learning for me was a very human experience. It was
mhm.
always that I was either with a textbook or with a person, and there was nothing in between. Now it's changed. There's so much online that people, I think, kind of just their reality of language learning is online. And this kind of creates these various kind of niches and cliques and cults and things like that. Um, and I think this feeds into the addictive nature that you're talking about of language learning. And I think it's probably different for everybody, but I think sometimes it can be quite unhelpful. And it's very common for people to spend more time on YouTube learning about language learning than actually learning languages.
Mhm.
And, and, um, and I also don't believe that like learning on YouTube or learning with apps is any kind of substitute for proper, good old fashioned study.
Mhm.
Um, so, so yeah, so I think to the extent that language learning is addictive online, it's because the internet just ramps that up on every level, especially social media.
Yeah.
But I think on a personal level, language learning is just addictive because I was addicted by it like back in the day before the internet, and the reason was that I think that once you get that smell, once you smell the fact I can actually communicate in another language,
Mhm.
and I can just I can speak to this person in another language, and then there's always more to learn,
You get that
and so
buzz, don't you?
yeah,
You
there's a
know?
huge buzz from being able to do it, incredible kind of personal satisfaction from being able to do it. But it's always, and you can get better and better, but it's always slightly out of reach as well. There's always that word that you didn't quite remember, and that thing that you mispronounced, and that
Yeah.
thing that you didn't quite understand. So like you can spend your whole life learning, and you never quite get there. It's like in dog racing, where they kind of had the rabbit that pulls around, and the dogs are chasing after the rabbit, and they can never quite get it. Language learning is a bit like that,
It's a
and
nice
so
one,
and
yeah.
so like as with anything where there's no resolution,
Mhm.
you're always going to be searching and pushing that little
Yeah.
bit harder.
It's 100%, and you're almost like, I suppose to have like a more vulgar comparison, like you're chasing your next hit almost, aren't you? Because I remember like with Spanish, one time I was coming in, I think I flew back from Belfast to Alicante, and I was going through customs at the airport, and there was a French man, and he didn't speak Spanish, and the ones who were speaking the minute, and he didn't speak English. And I was like, oh, perfect. He's like a diamond. And I was like, oh, I'll translate a bit for him. And it gave me like this buzz. And I was like, I haven't had that in Spanish in years. Do you know? Like, it's like, because now, obviously, because I live here and stuff, like, obviously, I love it and stuff, but you're not like, oh,
Yeah.
they understood me, do you know? And it felt like I got that.
I was at Manchester Airport a few years ago, and I remember an Italian guy coming up to me. He was obviously in transit somewhere, and he came up to me and he was just I can't remember what he asked me. Like, you know, so do you know when? Can you tell me when such and such a plane leaves and from what gate? And he asked me just straight up in Italian. I was like, wow. And I was able to respond to him like in Italian, and that's like, that was a huge buzz for me. The irony is that he didn't seem to give a shit really. It just kind of bounced off him like water off a duck's back. But I guess maybe that's often the case with people who, you know, if you're in a place and you don't speak any other languages, especially in Europe, you're probably not that interested in languages in general. So if someone responds, the fact that someone can reply to you in your own language is probably not such a big deal for you.
And they're almost the most interesting people, aren't they? They're the purest. Because like my English is tainted now because I've learned the grammar and I think about it. Whereas if I speak to some of my friends and I'm like, do we say that? I mean, no, it sounds weird and stuff. And their English is so pure. Or like some of my friends that don't learn English, you know, here in Spain. And it just feels like they're not thinking about pronunciation or whether I've used body para. Do you know, they're just like, oh, it doesn't sound right. Do you know? And it's a very interesting one. Let me see. I hope I have time just for the last question. Which is another one. I suppose it's one of those ones as well. It's a difficult one to answer. How do I deal with a plateau? I suppose I'm sure you've hit this many times at different levels. Because I suppose with your languages, you have different levels in each one. Do you change the whole different method? Do you introduce something new? Do you take a step back for a while?
So this is generally called, when we're talking about plateaus, the big plateau really for most learners is called the intermediate plateau, and it's what happens when you reach a kind of B1 level. And I think the reason this happens is because the better you get at a language, the longer it takes to move to the subsequent level. So for example, to learn A1 Spanish is pretty quick. You can do it in a matter of weeks, really. To learn A2 Spanish, well, that's going to take you a few months. To learn B1 Spanish, well, that's going to take you 6 to 12 months. To learn B2 Spanish is going to take you 1 to 2 years. Right? So it gets the time length kind of doubles with every CEFR bracket.
Diminishing returns, isn't it?
Right. And it's also the fact that once you get to that intermediate level, you can pretty much speak, you can communicate. You can, not perfectly, but you can get your point across, you can get what you need. And so everything that you start to learn then at the intermediate level is less and less immediately useful in speaking. So you can start to learn and practice the subjunctive, for example, but it doesn't really have any material effect on how well you can order a beer in the bar or whatever. And so you got this ongoing process by which you're studying and studying and studying, but you're not really feeling the benefit in your speaking. And that goes on and on and on and on for a long time. So it's my experience that when you hit that plateau, it's not the case that you stop learning. You're not actually plateauing. You're learning all the time. And especially if you are learning with stories through for example, with the books that I create, or my courses or whatever it is, like if you're learning through input, you are learning stuff. Your brain, if you're immersing yourself in books or in audio, your brain cannot help but take stuff in, right? It's just that what plateaus is your output and your ability to speak, because you've got to take in a lot more before you're able to step up to that next level. And so the main thing with the plateau is to remember that you are still learning, and you just got to keep going. And the rest of the prescription there is lots of reading and lots of listening, so that you give your brain as much nourishment as possible. And one of the things you can do even to supercharge that even more is to read and listen at the same time. That's something which a lot of people don't do, but it's a very easy way to just get that little bit of extra juice out of your study time, because then you can improve your listening comprehension and your and you're reading at the same time. And it helps also to strengthen your memory for vocabulary and things like that. So it's about pressing forward. Don't let the emotions of plateauing get to you, and then giving yourself as much exposure as possible. Less formal study, more exposure to the language through reading books, listening to podcasts and things like that, and then just keeping going all the time.
I think that's a great piece of advice, because it's about bringing in those different elements, as you said, like maybe because things like reading and listening at the same time, or even doing shadow reading, for your pronunciation and stuff. A lot of people maybe never think about doing those things. It's really interesting you say about the language becomes less useful as you get higher, because I remember I went to a medieval fair in Spain. I think it was when I was in Wales, I think 2015 or something, and it just so happened I had a Spanish lesson that morning. So I was like, "Oh, can you teach me like 15th century Spanish?" And like, "Oh, I think I know a few phrases." So I was going around the fair, and then my mates were like, "You better stop talking like that." Do you know? Because like I was trying to I was like, "No, but I've learned this." I want to ask him how your highness is. Do you know? And my friends were like, "Oh, you may stop that." But it's an interesting one, and I suppose if you get to those levels, almost being thankful that you've plateaued to a certain aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a case of, because I think what you're describing there is like very low frequency vocabulary,
Yeah,
right? And that's
yeah.
like that's stuff that you almost never use.
No.
So, but the stuff you learn at an intermediate level, it is useful, and it is stuff that you'll use. It's just that in the case of grammar, for example, it just doesn't feel as immediately useful as it used to. Because like if you imagine in your first few weeks of learning Spanish, you're learning to conjugate the verb ser, for example, soy, eres, es, somos. And you can immediately then say, I am, you are, he is. Like, boom, that's immediately deployable in the real world. And you learn certain words like manzana, plátano, mesa.
The words just opening up to you.
And like with every word you learn, it's like, wow, I can say this, now I can say that. But then really, what's the difference between iba and he ido and fui?
Yeah.
What's the material difference there? I mean, there is one, as we know, but they're going to understand you, whatever, like whichever one you use, they're going to understand you, right? And so but then to learn and master the difference between the imperfect, the past simple, and the present perfect can take years.
Yeah.
So you've got this thing where it's going to take you years to master this thing, which doesn't really make any immediate difference in your Spanish. And that psychologically is quite different. It must be like kind of England losing in the final of the Euros.
I didn't want to bring this up, so I didn't.
No, but like imagine you get to the final, you lose on penalties, and then you've got 2 years to wait until you've got another crack at it. It's like, oh my God, we just put all our heart and soul into this, and we've just lost, and now we've just got to sit on our asses for the next 2 years and then go through the whole thing again in the World Cup. It's like so psychologically, it's tough.
Yeah.
But there's nothing for it. You just got to go back to basics, keep up your training, and then try again next time. And so with the plateau, what happens is you're studying all these different things. You're studying, conditionals and subjunctive and future tenses and all these things. And it feels like you're not learning. But then one day, what happens is you get to a point where all of this grammar you've been studying comes together into a cohesive ball where something's just clicked. And you can just kind of see through to the truth of how this grammar works, and then you can start to use it naturally, because you've just reached this critical mass of understanding where like the web of Spanish has just been completed for you.
Yeah.
And all you've got to do is keep it up for long enough to get there.
Yeah, and it's definitely right, as you say, about like you get all these new things to start, then you start adding in shades, and then you get into like nuances of the language.
Yeah.
Well, because obviously my audience is focused on English speakers learning Spanish, and so just to finish up, I thought it would be nice if we could just have a minute or so of what courses in Spanish, like if my learners were to go on to iwillteachyoualanguage.com, what things would be available for them.
Sure. Well, thank you. Obviously, very happy to talk about that. But so my thing is stories, right? So I write books of stories, but I also teach through stories. And so I have many courses which focus on different areas of learning Spanish, but it all works through stories. So for example, I have a beginner's program called Spanish Uncovered, which teaches you Spanish from the beginning through story. I could explain how it works if you like, but people can check that out for themselves. It's a method that I created where you actually learn through story right from the word go, which is quite fun. And then I have courses that focus on listening comprehension. So, for example, we have one program called Conversations, which is all about it's like a soap opera that unfolds in the Spanish countryside with people and all in Spanish, but it's been very carefully designed to train your ear to understand spoken Spanish, because that's how I kind of created all of the stuff. And then we have another program called Grammar Hero, for example, which again teaches you the nuances of grammar, like the subjunctive and por versus para, ser versus estar, through stories that have been kind of carefully written to demonstrate and help you practice these different grammar points, together with like annotations and explanations of, okay, so you see why here he used the verb, or he used this tense instead of that tense, here's why. So again, it's like helping to just study and master different areas of the language through stories. So yeah, if you want to have a peruse of what we have, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com and then just click on courses in the menu bar, and you can kind of have a browse around and see what we've got. Hopefully you'll find something you like.
And if I can just add also the podcast, if you haven't checked it out already, please do. I think I mentioned before to you, I started on episode 7 or something. I think it was like 2015, 2016 or something. And
why didn't you start at episode 1?
No, I think when I started there was 7 on the go. Do you know?
Oh, so you were still listening? Wow, so you've been listening since then?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Man, that's quite.
I just didn't randomly go in, you know.
Oh yeah, because we're on episode 400 and something now. So I thought, well, if he's going to go back that far, like 400 episodes, why would you start?
Not just go the extra? Why not go to 6 or 5? Do you know, around number?
Yeah.
But Olly, it's been a great pleasure. I'm very happy to have spoken to you and stuff. I'm sure it'll be very useful to some of my students who are very happy.
This is all mine.
I just want to speak to you. I hope we get the opportunity to speak in the future, and I look forward to hearing about your future projects.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks for listening to the podcast for so many years. I appreciate that.
Perfect. All right. All the best now. Cheerio.
Cheers.